Welcome to Spiritual Steps, a podcast about learning to pray, listen, and grow by taking small steps on the spiritual journey. I'm your host, Stephen Hovatter, and this is episode 31, Gathered and Sent. In this year, in this season, we're trying to follow the spiritual steps of Jesus, and I want to, in this episode, examine one of the critical things that happens in Jesus' ministry, and I think with his disciples too, and that is the rhythm of coming into solitude and going out to do work in the world. The spiritual life of Jesus' people follows a similar rhythm, the rhythm of being gathered and being sent. Now, one of the things that strikes me as just paradoxical in the early chapters of the Gospel of Mark is the way that when the early disciples are called by Jesus, he seems to completely and radically call them out, call them away from their place in life, okay? Like the fishermen that are called by the Sea of Galilee. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, there in the first chapter of Mark, are called as they're working on their nets or they're in the boats. And Jesus calls them, and the text is just so stark in recording how they get up and they leave. They immediately leave the nets and follow him, is what the text says of Peter and Andrew. And then we're told that James and John immediately leave their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men, and they follow him. And what's striking to me about that story is not just the immediacy of how easily they seem to leave everything behind, but the way Mark tells it, there's like one episode between them, the story about the man with the unclean spirit who interrupts Jesus in the synagogue and then has this spirit sent out of him. But there's also, like right after that story, which is just a few verses, just 7 verses long, the very next thing that happens is we meet Jesus with his disciples at Simon Peter's house. Now, this strikes me as like a really strange and just fascinating little turn, right? Like on one hand, it seems like Jesus has just called him and said, "Come follow me," and Peter leaves everything behind. He abandons his nets there on the shore. But then we see Jesus at Simon's house. So yeah, there is a leaving, but there's also like a staying. And actually what happens is when Jesus first calls them, it seems like they join Jesus in his ministry, but they also come back into Peter's home too. See, there's stuff that happens out and there's stuff that happens in. And that's not accidental either, because the very next time that we have Jesus calling a disciple, it's the disciple Levi. And in chapter 2, Jesus calls Levi again. They're beside the sea, and when he calls him, Levi leaves his tax booth and follows him, okay? And again, it's striking. It seems like Levi is leaving everything behind. But the very next verse in Mark 2:15 is, as he said at dinner in Levi's house. And there were many tax collectors and sinners there with him. And this is, one of the stories where the Pharisees are kind of grumbling because Jesus is eating with all these outsiders and people that they didn't have respect for. Now, here's the thing, right? On one hand, it seems like Levi has immediately been called to leave everything and to follow Jesus in his mission in the world. But the next time we actually see Jesus at work in that mission is in Levi's house. So there is like a coming out, but there's a going home too. It's a strange little piece of the story. Really, I think it follows because Jesus' own ministry is kind of like this too, right? Like Jesus has these moments where he is engaged fully with all the people outside in the world, and then he has moments where he kind of withdraws, often into like deserted places, into the wilderness, but more to the point, he withdraws to a place where he can find solitude and prayer. And when he does that, Jesus has these moments where he seems to almost have clarity that emerges. For instance, like when he does that here in the first chapter of Mark, Jesus has been crowded around in the episode at Simon's house. He's been crowded with all these people that need his healing touch. And after he does that, he goes and he finds this place of solitude, and he basically hides out and prays. And by the time they catch up with him, he has clarity about where he needs to go next. He says, "This is my mission is to go and to teach in these other cities too. So I can't be pinned down." And so they go on, and that's kind of the rhythm of it. Is Mark is kind of showing us that Jesus is fully engaged in this ministry, and then he kind of pulls himself into this moment of prayer, and then right after that he has this other moment where he is telling the disciples that he's ready to go out into this other next phase of his mission. So this going and coming, this being gathered into or participating in mission and then retreating into solitude, this gathering and sending, I think, is part of what Jesus is at work doing in the world. See, he gathers his disciples to him, and then he sends them out. He gathers them to himself, and he sends them out, just like he joins the Father in solitude and prayer, and then he himself goes out, and he comes back home and goes out, comes in and goes out, like an accordion, like a breath, in and out. The ministry, participating in the ministry and mission of Jesus, means both being sent and gathered, both coming and going. So I want to pitch that as a real paradigm for the way that we engage in the process of following in the spiritual steps of Jesus, because we both follow him in his interior life as well as we can, learning his way of prayer, learning what it means to retreat into solitude and to spend time with God. But we also follow Jesus back out from the wilderness, out into the cities, back out into the towns, to reach out and to touch the people that need healing, to speak the words that need to be said. It is that movement back and forth that's what it means to participate in the spiritual life of Jesus. So I want to give a couple of just ideas of kind of how we do that. One of the things that we can do is to just try, whenever we're on one side of the fence, make sure that we give attention to, at least cognitively, mentally, give attention to what's on the other side. For instance, if you are engaged in service work, it's very helpful to take a breath in the middle of that and remember that you're doing that service, you're doing that work out of the identity, out of the spiritual center that comes from being a person of prayer and part of a community of disciples that gathers together and worships, okay? So that you carry your prayers with you into your work, into your service, okay? And that might be just as simple as having a moment, if it's just you by yourself at your work, that you just pause and you remember your moment of prayer in the morning. I mean, this could be something that happens in 2 seconds. You just kind of call your attention back, give yourself that mental image of what it meant to bow or kneel or whatever it is that however you're praying. And just call that to yourself, and remember that you're kind of in that same posture while you're working too. Now, the other side of the coin is it's important for us to remember while we're in the midst of our prayers that we will be carrying that identity, we'll be carrying that spiritual center with us out into our work too. So just like we, while we're at work, call to our minds an image, call to our imaginations what it means to be at prayer. In the other side, when we're at prayer, we have to call to our imagination what it will mean for us to be at work. And so we join with God in that, in our work, when we're in prayer too. So I just want to offer this because I think it's important if we can kind of look over the fence when we're on this, no matter which side of the gathering and sending motion we're at any given point, we can kind of call to mind the other, and it can give us a richer sense of participation in both of those movements. See, one of the big problems with the Christian church right now is that we see these things as too separated. In fact, sometimes we even imagine them as like separated out into ecclesial bodies, so that there are certain churches that have more of a focus on one than the other. But I think God would have us to have a unity of this, that we have a unity of the gathering and the sending, a unity of the coming and the going, the prayer and action. No less a light than Thomas Merton once wrote that all Christian life is meant to be this at the same time profoundly contemplative and rich in active work. It is true that we are called to create a better world in action, but we are first called to a more immediate and exalted task, that of creating our own lives. In doing this, we act as co-workers with God. See, Merton's insight there is that our creative life is both the creative work that we do outside and also our creative interior life in which we commune with God. And that's not just a word for contemplative monks. That's a word for all of us who both spend time in prayer, contemplation, meditation, but also time participating in the mission of God out in the world too. The spiritual life of Jesus' people follows the rhythm of being gathered and sent, the rhythm of prayer and action. Jesus gathers us, he sends us out, calls us into a world of mission, and he sends us home again. Mission and prayer are so closely intertwined that a person who is fully engaged in the spiritual life can scarcely tell where one ends and the other begins. Really, they're all the same thing. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, you want to just extend the conversation, you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Stephen Hovatter. And if this sort of thing's useful to you, then please go ahead, subscribe, whatever podcasting app you love, and also share it with somebody. Reach out to somebody else and share a podcast episode with them. All right, until then, keep taking the next step that you see in front of you, and may God be with you on each step of your journey. Peace.